December 18th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Grenadier Klaus Hartmann crouched behind a frost-covered oak tree, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 19 years old, he'd been in uniform for exactly 8 months, conscripted from his apprenticeship at a Munich metal workshop after the catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front depleted the Wehrmacht's reserves. The Iron Cross propaganda films had promised glory. Instead, he'd received 3 weeks of basic training, a carabiner 98K rifle that kicked hard enough to bruise his shoulder, and orders to march west for Hitler's last great offensive through the frozen Belgian forest. The past 4 days had been chaos. His company, part of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, had advanced through American lines during the initial surprise of Operation Watch on Rhine. They had marched through villages where American supply depots sat abandoned in hasty retreat, and what Hartmann saw there had begun to crack the foundation of everything Nazi propaganda had taught him about the enemy. Mountains of supplies, cases of ammunition stacked higher than a man's head, jerry cans of gasoline simply left behind because there were too many to carry, and food. Dear God, the food. Hartmann's own rations for the past month had consisted primarily of black bread so dense it sat in his stomach like a stone, occasionally supplemented with thin soup and ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. The official Wehrmacht daily ration was supposed to be 3,500 calories, but that was a fantasy from 1941. By late 1944, German soldiers were lucky to receive 2,000 calories daily. The bread was increasingly adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. Meat appeared perhaps once a week if they were fortunate. Fats and oils were precious commodities. Sugar was a distant memory. His squad had torn through the abandoned American supplies like starving wolves. They found white bread, actual white bread made from wheat flour, soft and fresh. Canned meat that wasn't just edible but actually tasted good. Coffee, real coffee, rich and dark. Chocolate bars in distinctive olive drab wrappers, more chocolate in a single crate than Hartmann had seen in his entire life. Cigarettes by the thousands, Lucky Strike and Camel brands that German soldiers would trade almost anything to obtain. His squad sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front named Müller, had stood staring at the supplies with tears in his eyes. "This is what they throw away," he'd said quietly. "This is what they leave behind when they retreat. What kind of nation fights a war with such abundance?" Now, on the 5th day of the offensive, Hartmann found himself separated from his unit after an American artillery barrage had scattered his company across 3 kilometers of forest. He had been searching for his squad when he heard the sound. American voices, speaking that strange, confident English that sounded nothing like the hesitant phrases Hartmann had learned in school. He'd frozen, bringing his rifle to his shoulder, and then he saw him. The American soldier emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees perhaps 30 meters away, moving cautiously but without the desperate hunted look that Hartmann saw in his own comrade's eyes. The American paused, scanning the forest, and Hartmann got his first clear look at an enemy soldier who wasn't dead or wounded. The man was enormous. That was Hartmann's first coherent thought. The American stood at least 6 feet tall, perhaps taller, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad beneath his field jacket. Even through the winter uniform, Hartmann could see that this man carried weight, actual weight, muscle and healthy tissue, not the gaunt wiriness that characterized the Wehrmacht by late 1944. The American's face, visible beneath his helmet, was smooth and well-fed, with full cheeks and the kind of healthy complexion that came from adequate nutrition. Hartmann, by contrast, stood 5 feet 8 inches tall in his boots and weighed perhaps 130 pounds, down from the 150 he had weighed at conscription. His ribs showed clearly. His face was hollow. His uniform, sized for a healthier Germany's army, hung loose on his frame. Looking at the American, Hartmann experienced a profound and demoralizing shock. This was the weak, soft, decadent American soldier he had been told about? This was the pampered enemy who supposedly couldn't endure hardship? The moment stretched. Hartmann knew he should shoot, should eliminate this enemy soldier who represented an invasion of the fatherland. His training screamed at him to pull the trigger. But something stopped him. Some fundamental recognition that his rifle, his presence, his entire ideology suddenly felt inadequate before this specimen of enemy health and vigor. The American turned, and their eyes met. What happened next would stay with Hartmann for the rest of his life. The American's hand moved, but not toward his rifle slung over his shoulder. Instead, he slowly raised both hands. Surrender. The American, who looked like he could break Hartmann in half with those large hands, was surrendering, because Hartmann held the rifle. Because in this moment, in this frozen forest, the possession of a weapon mattered more than physical supremacy. Hartmann stepped forward, his rifle trained on the American's chest, and gestured with the barrel for the man to move toward him. The American complied, walking slowly with his hands raised, and as the distance closed, the disparity in their physical conditions became even more apparent. The American's boots were new, well-oiled leather that repelled the snow. Hartmann's boots, issued used, leaked, and had been stuffed with newspaper to fill the gaps. The American's uniform was thick wool, properly fitted, designed for winter combat. Hartmann's uniform was cotton with a thin wool overcoat designed for a German winter, not the brutal cold of the Ardennes. As the American reached him, Hartmann gestured for him to turn around for a search. Standard prisoner procedure. His hands shook slightly, not from cold but from a combination of fear, exhaustion, and something else he couldn't quite name. The American complied, and Hartmann began patting down the pockets of his field jacket. The first pocket yielded 3 chocolate bars, D-ration emergency chocolate, though Hartmann didn't know the designation. Each bar contained 600 calories, deliberately formulated to provide energy in extreme conditions. Hartmann had consumed perhaps 800 calories that entire day. His hands trembled as he pulled out the chocolate, the brown wrappers proclaiming their origins in a country that could afford to give its soldiers candy a standard issue. The second pocket contained a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes unopened and a small book of matches. Cigarettes that German soldiers traded iron crosses to obtain, carried casually in an American private's pocket. The third pocket yielded a small tin of malted milk tablets, another energy supplement, and a packet of instant coffee. The fourth pocket contained chewing gum, 3 sticks of Wrigley's, a luxury so exotic that Hartmann's younger sister had only heard of it from older relatives who remembered before the war. The American's belt held a canteen that, when Hartmann unscrewed it, released the smell of actual coffee, hot coffee, from some source Hartmann couldn't imagine. The man's pack, when Hartmann ordered him to remove it and search through it, revealed rations that defied comprehension. K-rations, 3 meals worth, each package containing not just calories but variety. Canned meat, crackers, processed cheese, fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and more cigarettes. Each K-ration provided approximately 3,000 calories. The American carried 3 days' worth on his person. 9,000 calories in portable rations, more food than Hartmann's entire squad had received in the past week. There were other items, a small medical kit with genuine bandages, not the paper substitutes that were increasingly common in German medical supplies. A razor and shaving cream, luxuries that indicated this army expected its soldiers to maintain grooming standards even in combat. A paperback book, some American novel that Hartmann couldn't read but that spoke of an army with the time and inclination for recreational reading. A photograph of a young woman, smiling, healthy, standing in front of an automobile, not a military vehicle but a private automobile, the kind of possession that marked wealth in Germany, but apparently ordinary in America. Hartmann stepped back, his rifle still trained on the American but his mind reeling. He looked at his prisoner more carefully now, cataloguing details he had missed in the initial shock. The American's teeth, visible when he had been ordered to show identification, were straight and white. Hartmann's own teeth, like those of most Germans he knew, were in poor condition, cavities untreated because dental care was scarce. The American's fingernails were clean and trimmed. His skin, even in winter, showed the remnants of a healthy tan, not the greyish pallor that characterized German troops. The propaganda suddenly felt obscene. The Americans were soft. These men who stood a head taller, who carried more food in their pockets than German soldiers saw in a week, who wore uniforms that actually fit and boots that didn't leak. The Americans were decadent. These men from a country so wealthy it could equip every soldier with chocolate and cigarettes and coffee, with razors and books and photographs of loved ones standing next to private automobiles. Hartmann gestured for the American to sit against a tree. He needed to think. He needed to process what this encounter meant. The American complied, moving slowly, and Hartman noticed something else. Despite being a prisoner, despite having a rifle trained on him by an enemy soldier, the American didn't look afraid. Concerned, yes. Wary, certainly. But not the kind of existential terror that Hartman had seen in the eyes of his own comrades when artillery began falling. The American sat down with a certain dignity, a confidence that came from being part of an army that was fed, equipped, and supported by a nation of apparently limitless resources. Hartman's training told him he should march this prisoner back to German lines, hand him over to intelligence officers for interrogation, and collect credit for a capture. But several problems immediately presented themselves. First, Hartman wasn't entirely sure where German lines were anymore. The offensive had pushed forward, then stalled, then been hit by American counterattacks. Units were scattered, communication was sporadic. Second, he was alone with a prisoner who physically outmatched him significantly. If the American decided to resist, rifle or no rifle, the outcome was uncertain. Third, and this was the thought Hartman barely wanted to acknowledge, marching back toward German lines meant returning to hunger, cold, chaos, and an increasingly obvious path toward defeat. The American spoke. His German was terrible, heavily accented, just a few phrases clearly memorized from a manual, but the meaning was clear enough. He was asking for cigarettes. Hartman almost laughed at the absurdity. The prisoner, who had more cigarettes in his pockets than Hartman had smoked in the past month, was asking for permission to smoke. But then Hartman understood. It was a gesture of normalization, an attempt to establish some baseline of human interaction between them. Hartman nodded, and the American slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out the Lucky Strike pack, extracted a cigarette, and lit it with the book of matches. He took a long drag, then held out the pack toward Hartman, an offering. Hartman hesitated, then slung his rifle over his shoulder and accepted the cigarette. He lit it with trembling fingers and drew the smoke deep into his lungs. The tobacco was rich, smooth, nothing like the harsh ersatz cigarettes that were increasingly common in German supplies. Hartman felt light-headed. Whether from the quality tobacco or the sheer strangeness of the situation, he couldn't say. Here he was, a German soldier smoking an American cigarette with his American prisoner in the middle of a frozen Belgian forest, while the greatest military operation Germany could still mount was falling apart around them. The American spoke again, still in that terrible German. He was saying something about food, offering food. He gestured to the K-rations that Hartman had confiscated, indicating that Hartman should eat. The generosity coming from a prisoner to his captor was so unexpected that Hartman felt something crack inside him. He set down his rifle, keeping it within reach but not aimed, and opened one of the K-ration packages. The food was everything the abandoned supplies had promised. Real meat, actual crackers made from wheat, cheese that had texture and flavour. Hartman ate slowly at first, then faster, his body responding to the sudden influx of calories with desperate hunger. He consumed one entire K-ration package, nearly 3,000 calories in perhaps 15 minutes. His stomach, accustomed to near-starvation rations, cramped slightly from the sudden abundance, but he didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt full. The American watched him eat with an expression Hartman couldn't quite read. Not pity exactly, perhaps understanding, perhaps a recognition of what this moment meant. A German soldier so hungry he would accept food from his own prisoner. When Hartman finished, the American spoke again, this time in English, slowly and clearly. Hartman's school English was limited, but he caught the essential meaning. "The war is over for me," the American was saying. "I am a prisoner. But the war is not over for you. What will you do?" It was the question Hartman had been avoiding. He looked at the American, then at himself. He thought about his squad, scattered in the forest, hungry and cold. He thought about the offensive that was clearly stalling despite the initial success. He thought about the abandoned American supplies that represented casual abundance beyond German comprehension. He thought about the chocolate in his pocket, the cigarettes, the evidence of a nation so wealthy it could afford to lose supplies and simply bring forward more. Hartman had been raised on Nazi ideology. Germany was superior. The Aryan race was destined to rule. The Americans were weak, their racial mixing and Jewish influence making them soft and vulnerable. But here, in this frozen forest, with American chocolate dissolving on his tongue and an American cigarette burning between his fingers, facing an American soldier who looked healthier and stronger than anyone Hartmann had seen in months. The ideology felt like ash in his mouth. The physical disparity was undeniable. The American stood perhaps 4 inches taller. He probably outweighed Hartmann by 40 or 50 pounds of healthy tissue. His teeth were better. His skin was better. His equipment was better. His food was better. Everything about this man screamed abundance, health, industrial capacity, and national strength. And this was just one man, one private among millions, one small component of an army that appeared to be fed, clothed, and supplied with careless generosity. Hartmann thought about the statistics he had heard, the numbers the propaganda ministry dismissed as enemy exaggeration. America was producing 50,000 aircraft a year, they said. Impossible, the radio proclaimed. American industry was soft, inefficient, undermined by labor unions and racial mixing. But what if it wasn't propaganda? What if the Americans really could produce 50,000 aircraft a year or more? What if this abundance he was witnessing, this casual overflow of supplies, was just a tiny fraction of American capacity? The mathematics became inescapable. If one American soldier carried 9,000 calories of food, if American units left behind mountains of supplies when they retreated, if every American truck and tank and aircraft represented a fraction of limitless production, then what chance did Germany have? The nation that had been rationing food since 1939, that was using horse-drawn wagons to supplement truck transport, that was sending teenagers and old men to the front because the manpower reserves were exhausted. What chance did such a nation have against this? The American was speaking again, more slowly now, trying to communicate something important. He was pointing back the way he'd come, toward American lines. He was explaining in simple words and gestures that American forces were close, very close, that reinforcements were coming, that the German offensive was being contained. He wasn't threatening, simply stating facts as he understood them. And then he said something that Hartmann's limited English could just barely comprehend. "Go home," the American said. "The war is lost. Go home." The words hung in the frozen air between them. They were treason, of course, defeatism, the kind of thinking that got German soldiers shot by their own military police. But they were also, Hartmann realized with a sinking certainty, true. The war was lost. Perhaps it had been lost at Stalingrad. Perhaps it had been lost when America entered the conflict. Perhaps it had been lost the moment Germany had challenged nations with populations and industrial capacity that dwarfed its own. But it was certainly lost now, here, in this forest, made manifest in the physical disparity between a starving German teenager and a well-fed American private. Hartmann stood up slowly. He picked up his rifle. The American watched him, tense now, uncertain what was about to happen. Hartmann looked at his prisoner, this enemy soldier who had somehow become a mirror showing Germany's true position in the world. He thought about his mother in Munich, probably queuing for rations that never seemed to arrive. He thought about his sister, 14 years old, being inducted into anti-aircraft duties because there was no one else. He thought about his father, killed at Kursk, dying for victories that had turned to ashes. He made his decision. Hartmann gestured for the American to stand up. The man rose cautiously, hands ready to be raised again if necessary. But Hartmann was reaching into his own pockets, pulling out the confiscated items, the chocolate, the cigarettes, the K-rations. He pushed them back into the American's hands, the gesture clumsy but clear. The American's eyes widened in confusion. Hartmann used his limited English vocabulary, supplemented with gestures. "Go," he said. He pointed back toward American lines. The American stared at him, trying to understand if this was a trick, some cruel game before execution. But Hartmann stepped back, lowering his rifle. "Go," he repeated. He gestured more urgently. The American hesitated another moment, then seemed to understand. He nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps something like respect. He began backing away, hands still partially raised, unwilling to turn his back on a German soldier with a rifle. Hartmann watched him go, the American's bulky form disappearing between the trees, heading back toward his own lines, carrying his food and cigarettes and all the physical evidence of a nation that could afford to equip its soldiers like kings. When the man had vanished completely, Hartmann sank down against a tree, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. He didn't know what he was going to do next. He couldn't return to his unit without a prisoner and would have to explain the encounter. He couldn't admit he'd released an American soldier without facing severe punishment or even execution. But in that moment, sitting in the frozen forest with an empty stomach again but a mind full of unwanted clarity, Hartmann knew with absolute certainty that everything he had been told was a lie. The Americans weren't weak. They were strong, fed by an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. They weren't decadent. They were practical, equipping their soldiers with what they needed to fight effectively. They weren't racially inferior. They were healthier, taller, better fed than the supposedly superior German soldier. Every aspect of the ideology that had driven Germany to war was revealed as hollow propaganda when confronted with the simple physical reality of a well-fed American private. In the distance, Hartmann heard artillery, American artillery, the distinctive crump of shells that seemed to fall without limit, as if the Americans had infinite ammunition to expend. Which, he realized, they probably did. A nation that gave its soldiers chocolate and cigarettes as standard rations could certainly afford to fire artillery shells without counting costs. A nation that left behind mountains of supplies, when retreating could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The cold was seeping into his bones, but Hartmann didn't move. He was thinking about the war, about its inevitable conclusion, about the gap between what he had been told and what he had just witnessed. The American soldier's face stayed with him, that healthy, confident face of a man who didn't question whether he would eat tomorrow, whether his boots would hold together, whether his country could continue to support its army in the field. Days later, when Hartmann finally found his way back to what remained of his company, he said nothing about the encounter. He reported becoming separated during artillery fire and spending several days hiding in the forest before finding German lines. No one questioned his story too closely. Too many others had similar experiences as the offensive collapsed. But Hartmann carried the memory with him through the rest of the war, through the retreat back into Germany, through the final chaotic months as the Reich crumbled. He would survive the war, barely, surrendering to American forces in April 1945 near Munich. The soldiers who took his surrender fed him K-rations and gave him cigarettes, just as casual in their abundance as that first American he'd encountered in the Ardennes Forest. They processed him through a prisoner system that fed him better than his own army had in the war's final years. He gained 15 pounds in American captivity, watching in stunned silence as former enemies treated German prisoners with more dignity and better supplies than Germany had provided its own soldiers. Years later, in the 1960s, Hartmann would emigrate to America, driven partly by economic opportunity but partly by a memory of that moment in the forest. The memory of looking at an enemy soldier and seeing not weakness but strength, not decadence but health, not an inferior opponent but a better fed, better equipped, better supported soldier from a nation that had won the war through sheer industrial and agricultural abundance. He would tell his children, born in America, about the encounter, about the chocolate and cigarettes, about the height and health disparity, about the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered completely. His son, hearing the story, would ask why his father hadn't shot the American when he had the chance. Hartmann's answer would be simple and honest, because I looked at him and knew we had already lost. He was living proof that everything we had been told was a lie. The German soldier's first encounter with an American GI became, for those who experienced it, a moment of profound disillusionment. Not dramatic, not accompanied by speeches or grand revelations, just the simple, undeniable recognition that the enemy was taller, healthier, better fed, better equipped, and backed by resources that made German deprivation look not like noble sacrifice, but like the desperate scrabbling of a nation that had reached beyond its means and was paying the price in the bodies and health of its young men. The chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the casual abundance that American soldiers carried in their pockets, these were not just supplies, they were evidence. Evidence of industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and national wealth that propaganda couldn't obscure. Evidence that Germany had started a war it could never win against opponents who could afford to give their soldiers luxuries while Germany's soldiers went hungry. In thousands of encounters like Hartmann's across the Western Front in 1944 and 1945, German soldiers came face to face with American GIs and experienced the same shock, the same recognition of physical disparity, the same dawning awareness that they had been lied to. Some, like Hartmann, chose mercy. Others fought on with a desperate loyalty. But all of them, confronting the physical reality of a well-fed enemy, understood at some level that the war was already lost, had perhaps always been lost. From the moment Germany had challenged a nation that could afford to give its soldiers chocolate as standard equipment,